Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. Pakistan's economy has been faced with many difficulties and challenges. The current government is trying its utmost to steer the country out of this economic crisis, and it has also blamed the previous government of Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf led by Imran Khan of bringing the Pakistan's economic status to this particular level, and recent devastating floods also added to the difficulties of the country's economy. The government is doing its utmost, taking some difficult decisions also, but at the same time the value of rupee also touched record lows during the last year of 2022. And the government associated it with the speculators and smuggling. At the same time, the IMF ninth review for the release of $1.18 billion in the extended fund facility to Pakistan is also delayed. But the government and the authorities have expressed their resolve to complete the IMF program. And now what the government can do to deal with the speculators and smuggling to help appreciate the value of rupee against the greenback, and how crucial is the release of this IMF tranche in the immediate term to stabilize the country's economy, and how important and crucial is the collective wisdom of all the political stakeholders to steer the country out of this economic crisis. And the government has also often talked about the Charter of Economy. Can it provide a roadmap for the sustainable policy making and its implementation? And to look into the answers of these questions, we are honored to have been joined in the studio by Mr. Faheem Sardar. He's Senior Policy Specialist from Strategic Policy Planning Cell. Mr. Sardar, thank you very much for taking time out for Views on News. Really appreciate that. And on Skype, we are being joined by Ms. Ariba Shahid. She's a business journalist. Ms. Ariba Shahid, thank you very much for your time, also for being on Views on News. Now, let me begin the discussion with you, Mr. Sardar. So what major challenges do you think the government is faced with right now in order to steer the country out of this economic crisis?
Thank you. Firstly, there is a currency liquidity crunch, which basically is focused on the US dollar. Why? Because most of our trade is in US dollars. It's denominated in US dollars. If we had a broader spectrum of currencies, we would be facing a different situation. So right now, Pakistan, we've had improved tax collection. We have seen the resilience of the Pakistan economy. We have seen the remittances go down just a bit. We have seen the slowdown of certain aspects due to international demand. That is all one aspect, but when it comes to the currency crunch, that's how I like to define it. The currency crunch is basically that the world is basically getting its dollars sucked towards America because they're raising interest rates. That's happening at a time when we needed more currency inflows. Collectively, these 2-3 factors have caused a lot of issues. One of the issues is also the smuggling of dollars outside of Pakistan physically. So that needs to be curtailed. When we put all these 3 things together, we get the unfortunate result that we have in front of us.
So talking about the first aspect that you've just highlighted, that the dollar is being sucked back into the United States of America, the prime reasons for that?
The prime reason for that is that America has had a low interest rate policy for a very long time. That has basically given their stock markets, their money markets, an unprecedented boom. For an extended period, which usually does not happen. That has also given rise to inflation. You see, we have to understand something, that America is the most sensitive about one thing. It's not about terrorism. It's not about nuclear weapons. They are most sensitive about inflation. And for that, they will do anything to bring down inflation, because it's such a huge country. They cannot afford to have inflation rising. So what they're doing is they're raising interest rates. Interest rates are, I think, just above 5% right now, if I'm not mistaken, and the US Federal Reserve has jacked it up very aggressively. It's going to jack it up even further, although there are indications that their inflation has started to ease up. Having said that, America is doing that to basically cool down its markets and to reset some of their markets, so to speak. I personally think that they're basically ready for some kind of a conflict, for which they're creating a value buffer. in their own society. That's a separate debate. I won't get into that right now. But one of the major points is that when they're raising interest rates, their housing market has come under severe stress. Why? Because their markets are primarily dependent on credit and exotic products, and all of them are basically dependent on liquidity. So when liquidity is going down, so everything starts to squeeze up. According to my estimates, roundabout prices in many of the U.S. states, house prices have gone down by 30%.
So the depreciation of the value of the rupee is not exclusive. That's what you mean to say. It's with the other currencies of the world.
It's not also. Because when you look at the euro to dollar parity, it's literally at parity, par, almost. Okay. When you look at how it has been doing against other currencies, the dollars are being sucked out. So it's just a simple demand supply.
So that comes in the international perspective. So specifically talking about the depreciation of value of rupee. So what reasons do you associate with that? So there is a 21% of high depreciation of the rupee against the dollar. And in August, the differential was 28%.
Sure. The rupee, when we speak specifically of the rupee, what's happened is that exports have slowed down, and we've had a dip in remittances. And our remittance scheme, which was a dollar denominated, the state bank scheme, I'm sorry, I've just forgotten the name for some reason, that there's been a dip in that as well. So when you put together these elements, there is a decrease in supply. Having said that, our dollars are being smuggled. The dollars that are in Pakistan are being physically smuggled into other countries, the Middle East countries, to Afghanistan and perhaps some other places. Thirdly, there are some restrictions on how much you can sell without being tagged for the CNIC. The FATF clearly says that you can sell. You need a CNIC identification at $15,000 when you liquidate $15,000 in a Pakistani market. The State Bank of Pakistan, I believe, is doing it at $1. So there's like a huge problem.
Right. Let me bring in Ms. Ariba Shahid also into the discussion. Ms. Ariba, this depreciation of the value against the dollar, as soon as Sardar took over the finance ministry, the rupee stabilized against the dollar, and this particular trend continued for almost 2 weeks. Then we again saw that this particular trend was temporary and there was a dip. Now the government, especially Mr. Sardar, when he took over the reins of the finance ministry, he associated with this particular value of the rupee against the dollar with the speculators, and a strict action was also to be taken against them. Now we have seen another aspect, the smuggling of the dollar across the border. How do you think the government can look into these both aspects and issues, and how to curb that?
So, like you said, when Sardar came in, the rupee stabilized, and that was a knee-jerk reaction to the market expecting the rupee to stabilize. A panic sentiment where people were buying dollars had calmed down, and people had started to supply dollars and sell out because they knew that Sardar would try to manage the currency like he did in the past, and he is a strong believer in the managed currency. And also by the statements that he had made in the past with the rate and what the expected value of the dollar is supposed to be. However, despite that, the rupee started to depreciate, considering our import payments and considering the outflows that we had to incur. Over the past few weeks, the rupee has been relatively stable, despite the spread between the interbank and the open market increasing significantly. And this shows you that right now we've got a lot of remittance coming in from informal channels. This is incentivizing informal channels. And in addition to that, with the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and with Afghanistan's foreign reserves being in control, a lot of Pakistani foreign exchange is going into Afghanistan through smuggling. And that is another pressure that is added onto the PKR. Just like Faheem Sardar had earlier said, that the dollar has been appreciating across all currencies because of the interest rate rising there. Despite that, there are multiple shocks that are happening in Pakistan, like, for instance, the increase in Hawala Hundi, the decrease in inflows through proper channels. But at the same time, what is alarming is that this whole, for the past 6-7 months, the state bank had been rationing out foreign exchange in the form of import payments. And just a few minutes before our show right now, the State Bank has reversed the prior approval required for importing some goods. So what we're seeing right now is, until this point, the currency you see, despite the falls, despite the rises, was largely controlled through other means, where the imports were curtailed. However, we will see the right impact of a market-determined exchange rate, or hopefully so, following January 2nd, whereby these restrictions are being released by the State Bank.
Right. Your point is well taken, Ms. Ariba. Shahid, Mr. Sardar, when we talk about, there is another aspect that the government authorities are highly looking forward to, and the government has expressed resolve regarding this particular, the completion of the IMF program. But the ninth review regarding the release of tranche of $1.18 billion is still delayed. So how crucial do you think it is in the immediate term in order to give stability to the economy in the country, and what the government needs to do in order to secure it?
Right now, Pakistan is dollar thirsty, so any kind of inflow will be a welcome sign. I mean, I personally think that we need much more than this, but that's a separate debate. But if the IMF tranche comes in, it will be helpful. It's not going to resolve the problem. The problems that we're facing will be resolved permanently and conclusively when we focus again on generation of value. When we start focusing on things like increasing remittances, increasing exports, and I'll come to exports again. When we start focusing on plugging the hemorrhage that our country is facing. So when we talk about exports, we should understand that our capacity to export is not at where we are right now. It's much more than this. People talk about exportable surplus and so on and so forth. That's fine, but we have to be able to sell whatever we can in whatever currency that is necessary, so that we can at least generate more foreign exchange. Right now, I'm not seeing any let up in the dollar requirement. So if the IMF gives the tranche, and if the review is successful, then of course it's going to be helpful, but it's not going to be a permanent solution. Once again, just to repeat myself, the permanent solution lies in the generation of value through the assets that we already have.
So we'll be talking about how to increase the generation of value. That requires, of course, increasing the production capacity and increasing the industrial base, if I'm correct on that front.
Well, yes and no. I mean, what you're saying right now is for the medium to long term, and we're talking about a quantum leap. We're not talking about that right now.
Right.
All I'm saying is that with our existing infrastructure.
So what those particular specific sectors could you identify in order to increase the export on that?
One is food,
front?
Pharmaceuticals, IT, and we had seen a considerable, a very encouraging level of growth in these sectors. When we talk about IT, our IT had really actually started to take a...
The Prime Minister recently has emphasized on increasing the IT exports also. But the current volume remains to be around $2 billion. So how it could be enhanced? There is an estimated benchmark that Prime Minister alluded to, that is $5 billion annually. How it could be brought from $2 to $5 billion?
$5 billion has been quoted many times, and rightly so, because that is something that we should keep as a floor, not even as a ceiling. So how do we do that? We basically do that through whatever operational things that are needed for IT companies to perform. We need to fulfill that. There are bottlenecks, there are issues, there are limitations, there are remittance issues. The Russian digital account was being linked to the IT system. We have to check if that's been done or not. Even if it has been done, I know for a fact that many IT people, IT companies are keeping their money abroad. Having said that, now let's shift to many of our major exporters who are given subsidies. They are parking their dollars abroad. Now, these are temporary phenomena unless we sort of encourage them and we make sure that those dollars come to Pakistan, especially if somebody or some segment has received subsidies. Our major sectors which can really yield a lot of very quick results are IT, pharmaceuticals, even textiles, I will say. Because, you know, we do have an end-to-end development.
So in the immediate term, when you also mention that we can increase the exports through food and textiles also, after the in the aftermath of the recent devastating floods, don't you think this particular area happens to be a constraint for Pakistan because the crops have been badly hit in the larger portion, especially when we talk about Sindh? And then we talk about the cotton crop also had a severe impact because of the recent floods.
There's an absolute issue, very rightly said by you. We would only be exporting what we can export. What we need domestically, we're not supposed to export it. But we have to bear one thing in mind, and this, whether we have floods or not, the World Bank has said that we have a wheat production capacity of 89 million tons, and we're stuck at 27. So that just itself is a reflection of where we should be standing. Let's not call it, you know, let's not look at the high estimate that an organization has given. Let's take a middle view. Let's talk about 50 million. But we have to focus on, we have to bear one thing in mind when we talk about crops. Many crops, high yielding crops, only need 4 months to grow. So that's a 4-month cycle that we can sort of work on. We import ginger, we import garlic. These things can be grown in a few months. It does not take years.
Right. We are joined by another participant on the phone line by Dr. Niaz Murtaza. He's political economist. Dr. Murtaza, thank you very much for taking time out for Views on News tonight. What sort of challenges do you think the current government is faced with when it comes to the economic front?
Well, obviously, the most important thing is, you know, the falling reserves that we have. It's about $6 billion that is left with the state bank, and that's you know, worth about, say, about 1.5 months of imports. Our imports are about 4.5 billion now. So the biggest worry is, you know, the fact that, you know, our reserves are falling, and there aren't any, you know, immediate sort of inflows that we can expect, because it is all tied to the IMF program. So I would say the biggest challenge is to somehow get that back on an even keel. There are a lot of issues that are still pending with the IMF, differences of opinion on, you know, tax issues, power tariffs, the dollar rupee parity rate, and so on. And so far, you know, we haven't been able to make, you know, much headway on that. So I would say that is the biggest challenge facing the government. And once that is out of the way, then, you know, there might be more inflows, and then, you know, you can talk about other issues like inflation, like unemployment, and so on. But that is the biggest challenge at the moment.
Right. So, Dr. Murtaza, Planning Minister Hassan Iqbal has said that the new conditions with the which the IMF have laid forth, they are too harsh. Now, how the government can go with that balance, not in order to burden the common man, at the same time following those conditions which are set by IMF, as the government has expressed the resolve that it will complete the IMF program?
Well, I mean, that's true. I mean, there is no doubt about that. You know, look at what, you know, people have gone through, you know, the poor people in this country. 4 years of, you know, double-digit inflation, a lot of unemployment because of COVID, and then, you know, the floods. So obviously, you know, this is not the right time to, you know, think about applying a standard, harsh IMF program. There is no doubt about that. And I think the IMF itself should also be aware of that, and it should make, you know, some provisions for that and give some relaxations. But then, you know, the IMF is IMF. They sit in Washington, D.C., and they don't have a very good feeling about, you know, a finger on the pulse of the poor people in Pakistan. So anyway, you know, there are the standard, you know, mechanisms. You know, you have negotiations with them. You know, you try to go through, you know, the big donors of IMF. We have improved relationships with them under the new government, you know, with countries like the US, the European Union, and so on. Try all those mechanisms, but then we also need to be clear. I do realize that the government is trying to, you know, protect the poor from the harsh IMF conditions. But if it doesn't go through, and, you know, the program falls, and then, you know, the rupee goes in free fall, then the pain that people will feel will be much higher than what will come from the IMF program. So it's a thin tight rope that the government is walking on, and the more time you waste, the more the reserves will fall, and the bigger will be the devaluation that will be needed. So I would say spend as much time talking to IMF, and then there's a call to be made. If they are completely intransigent, stubborn, they're not going to do, then looking at the situation, then you have to take some harsh decisions.
So, Dr. Murtaza, when the entire world knows, and this issue was raised on the international forum also, the United Nations Secretary General in person came here in Pakistan, and he saw the kind of damage and the losses incurred by the climate-induced floods in Pakistan. Now, after this particular understanding, when the entire world knows, don't you think there should be a realization on the part of the IMF also to show some sort of flexibility?
Well, that is the thing. The UN has very different lenses. It wears humane lenses. The United Nations chief is responsible for all the humanitarian operations that UN agencies are undertaking here, like the WFP, World Food Program, World Health Organization, and several other agencies, and he gets information from them. But when it comes to the IMF, it's a completely different ball game. They have their own way of looking at things, and then the best course is to talk to the big donors like the USA, European Union, who are of course funding the humanitarian operations in Pakistan. But at the end of the day, you have to take hard decisions, and if it looks you're not making much headway, then letting the program collapse will cause much greater harm to the poor, to the very same poor people that the government is rightly trying to protect. And at that time, then some harsh decisions will have to be made, and then there's always the option, you can tax the rich people to create more fiscal space. So there is some leeway available, although increasing taxes is not the right strategy when you're already facing stagnation. So this is the nature of the conversation that we need to have, and then at the end of the day take some hard decisions.
Right, Dr. Murtaza, your point is well taken. Please stay with us. Ms. Ariba, Shahid, when we talk about the realization among the IMF ranks about being a little flexible after Pakistan was faced with the damages and losses incurred because of the devastating floods, and the international community has been sensitized, particularly when the United Nations Secretary General himself came in person over here. Don't you think there should have been a realization on the part of IMF and to show a little bit of flexibility rather than putting such harsh conditions towards Pakistan?
So earlier this year during the IMF meetings, in the fall meetings, I was there in DC, and this was a question that had come up multiple times during discussions. And this was a question that I had conversations on and off record about. And the considerations that the IMF is putting in are more based on the fact that Pakistan is getting aid, Pakistan is getting support. However, austerity and fiscal responsibility is something that the IMF wants to instill into the government. Because the measures where, for instance, the dollar or the rupee is being kept stable artificially, let's say, supposedly, that is damaging in the long run. So the IMF is trying to make Pakistan make the right moves regardless of the flood at hand, because of the fact that the international community has been sensitized and we are receiving the right aid that we had been hoping for. Despite that, it's not just this time around, it's Pakistan's track record with the IMF during the Imran Khan regime back in the first quarter of 2022. The fact that prices were given a subsidy and they were kept that way for so long, and this was in contrary to what the IMF wanted Pakistan to do. So time and time again, Pakistan has done against what the IMF has wished or advised us to do. Similarly, there have been other things that Pakistan has needed to act on. For example, Treasury Single Account, which does not have anything primarily to do with the flood, but Pakistan has not been able to implement that. So if the IMF is not being listened, it is probably because a lot of conditions that do not have anything to do with flood are not met. And this is a problem that Pakistan has had over the past few years.
Right, your point is well taken. So, Mr. Sardar, when we talk about the conditions by the IMF, so the objections or the conditions which are set on subsidies regarding the power tariffs and also the energy sector. Now, how do you think, what basically irks the IMF the most? Is it the blanketed subsidies or targeted subsidies?
I think both. Because the IMF is trying to make sure that the coffers of the government are full. And the IMF, let's face one fact, the IMF is in no position to give anybody, any country, in any circumstance, any leeway, because the IMF will go bankrupt. We have to understand that. The IMF is a lender to more than 150 countries. Can you imagine if 100 countries start saying, you give us a 10% rebate? The IMF will be bankrupt. And this, I mean, this has happened not once, but many times in the past 30 years, that when a country defaults, the whole system starts to collapse. There's a domino effect. I won't get into that. Right now, the IMF is very particular about any kind of expense that the government is doing. So what the IMF is trying to do, rightly or wrongly, is to bring down the expenses and to push up the revenue so that there is a positive gap, a larger positive gap which can allow you to absorb the shocks of today and tomorrow. The IMF is going to obviously focus on, and I have to be very cold here, on how the government can generate revenue. The government generates revenue through taxes, through basically any kind of inflow, and of course from non-tax revenues. In all circumstances, the government will be exercising its power to get more from the whatever regulatee is. At the end of the day, the IMF is like, if you can generate more revenue from some other source, do it.
So what about the fuel import bill? It happens to be a larger chunk of the overall expenditure. So the government has been talking about looking for new avenues and also the idea of shifting to the renewables. How important that one is? So would it really considerably reduce the import bill or our dependency on the imported fuel?
Reducing our dependence on something that we've been doing for almost 70 years is going to, you have to do it on a war footing basis, and it has to be done through a plan. Let's take it one by one. I'll try to be quick. When we talk about crude oil, we're basically importing crude oil from the Middle East, from OPEC countries, and Saudi Arabia in particular. So moving away from that source, because Saudi Arabia is following the OPEC prices, and of course when the price went up to $100, we've experienced that before, but at that time the rupee was close to 70 per dollar. So there is a huge differential that we faced, and as per the economic survey, we had to pay $4 billion additional to buy oil. So that was because we depreciated the rupee, and then we allowed ourselves to sort of free float the rupee, which I have a serious objection to. When we try to shift to another source, or when we try to shift to renewables, that is extremely important, but that requires a lot of planning, and it requires a lot of, how shall I say, careful execution, because every minute that you spend on another source is going to cost money. And you're investing in another source to save the overall larger quantum.
So what about finding other avenues for the crude oil import?
Yeah, there is another avenue. There is another avenue. I've worked on it. You can generate, you can create crude oil from dirty water. And Brazil is the leading country in this.
That's a very interesting
yes,
point.
I've actually proposed a project on this. So it's not like, and it's not very complicated.
How is it done?
What happens is you take used water and you have to allow it to stagnate. And then you have to let algae come on top of it. Then you have to give it carbon dioxide. I'm not a biochemist, so I'm not an expert. But what happens is the algae starts to turn black. You have to put that black algae through a biorefinery, and guess what comes out? Two products. One is crude oil, bio-crude oil, and the second is a hard substance which is rich in nutrients, which is used as a fertilizer. So Brazil is at the top of this, and this I've taken up this project myself, trying to push it. What I'm trying to say, there's always an alternative, but you have to have a plan. and then you have to execute it absolutely mercilessly and without delay.
Right. Dr. Murtaza, what do you suggest how to reduce the dependency on the imported fuel? Either it is shifting to the renewables or finding the new avenues to import the crude oil with a lesser price cap?
Well, yeah, I think it requires multiple alternatives, strategies, and, definitely, leaving yourself to the vagaries of, the international oil market, and given the fact that, our exports are so stagnant, and we always have a huge current account deficit. It's critical. That's the biggest chunk of our imports. It's fuel related. So if we can reduce that, that will go a long way. But obviously, it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. You can go for solar. You can go for hydro. You can go for local coal. A lot of other options. Trying to get cheaper oil from Russia. So the government is, of course, working on many of these options. But the fact of the matter is that, it's going to take a long time, and we don't have that time. We have to resolve this issue with the IMF in the next, few weeks. Otherwise, things could go very wrong badly. So it's a matter of prioritizing what your long-term strategies are, but then also your short-term strategies.
Right. Dr. Murtaza, when we talk about the political stability in the country and the collective wisdom to steer the country out of this dire economic challenge, how crucial that one is, and what happens to be the responsibility of all the political stakeholders in that regard?
Well, obviously, it's not just because of one factor. There are four factors that are, in play at the moment. One is, the economic crisis that started last year around June, July, when, the rupee started depreciating and our reserves started falling. They had peaked in September 2021 at $20 billion with State Bank. And by the time, PTI left, they were down to about $10 billion. So, there was this economic crisis that had started under PTI. Then, the Ukraine war and the impact that it had on, oil prices and the recessionary global situation, then, the floods, and then finally we have, the political instability that we've had since, the beginning of this year. First of all, the vote of no confidence, and then, the PTI's reaction to it, and then its reaction after it lost power, the constant dharnas, the leaving from the National Assembly, trying to, push for early elections in a very aggressive manner. Obviously, all that has, created a lot of political instability, and you can see it in, some of the more volatile inflows that we normally have. So things like, Russian digital account, they have started falling, and some of that might be because of the political instabilities. Remittances, a little bit, maybe all that. So, there's multiple factors, and now if terrorism increases again, that will be another huge problem. So obviously, all of these have to be tackled, but to tackle all of them, I think the bedrock has to be political stability. And unfortunately, we don't have a situation where, the opposition and the government can sit down and try to think first about, the country and what is needed. Obviously, what we need is, some political stability so that some decisions can be taken, but that's not happening.
Right. Ms. Ariba, how crucial is this political maturity by all the political stakeholders and avoiding the politics of confrontation in order to steer the country out of the economic crisis?
So first and foremost, passing the next review is utmost important. With the opposition or any other political party pressuring the government to undertake measures that are not sustainable for Pakistan in the long run is a crime to the country and is a crime as a citizen. So that said, it is essential for all political parties to put the best interests of the country. And a charter of economy is something that has been talked about for a very long time. However, there hasn't been much movement on it, despite the PDM being consisting of 15 different parties. So there is some consensus on one part. But the next review proves to be imperative for Pakistan. Earlier today, also, our former finance minister, Miftah Ismail, had also gone on record saying that without the next review, Pakistan is in significant trouble. And could head towards a default. While I do not think a default situation is at present available because we do not have any immediate dues internationally, but the next review is crucial and all political parties need to realize that. Pakistan needs to
Ms.
continue.
Ariba, the government authorities often talk about that economy shouldn't be politicized. And when we keep these sort of statements of the government authorities in view, how important and crucial do you think a political consensus when it comes to the Charter of Economy happens to be?
So, truth be told, when you talk about the economy, it's driven by sentiments and it's driven by statements. So statements drive sentiments, and sentiments impact the economy significantly. So every move that politicians make, willingly or unwillingly, do have an impact on the economy. So with the government at hand, any government, when in government, says that our move should not be politicized, need to come out with clear communication. And if, for instance, the opposition party is politicizing movements, the government needs to come out with clear communication and instill confidence in the public that they are taking the right measures. So regardless of whether we have a charter of economy or not, there is a very strong need for clear communication and to communicate the need of the hour to the people.
Right. Mr. Sardar, how important it is to avoid politicizing economy and how Charter of Economy can help bring in the political consensus on that front?
For the past 8 years, I've been saying that the economy and politics need to have a divorce and they need to go their separate ways and need to stop talking to each other, which is not possible. But if you look at the economies of Italy, Japan, they are always, every time summer sets into Italy, a new government comes in. But the economy keeps moving for 2-3 reasons. Number one, because they've enshrined in their bureaucracy and in their economic systems a mechanism that things, policies, issues, recommendations, implementation keeps moving. So if there's a political issue, it always has a cascading effect. It always has a radiating effect onto the economy, which is fine. But when we have them completely fused together, that's where the problem starts. Same thing happens, what happens in Italy happens in Japan as well. They have so many, every, I think, year and a half, they have a new government. But that just doesn't seem to bother their economy. So we need to sort of craft a system which is perhaps the Charter of Economy. The Charter of Economy is just to very quickly touch upon that. It has to be done in stages, time-wise and topic-wise. The first stage I would call is the most crucial because that's where all people who are looking in different directions have to agree to some very basic things. And the first point, I'll just leave food for thought for everyone, is violence. And disruptions. You cannot allow violence and disruptions to happen in economic areas. Everybody has to agree to that. Everybody's a winner from that. So what you do is you basically bring up these aspects which are acceptable to everybody, whether they like it or not. You just stick to that only in the short period. Then you decide on more sophisticated things and far more, let's just say, intricate things, and then you move on to the long term, where you have a long-term view about the economy. Pakistan needs that extremely importantly right now. Pakistan has to have some kind of an understanding internally where the economy does not stop, where the economy does not falter. Politics has to be, as you said, the politicization of the economy has to be reduced. And just before we started, I mentioned to you that people are talking about the economy with absolutely unfettered in an unfettered manner. It's not meant to be discussed by everyone. People should talk about it, but when it comes to giving public statements, we should sort of just be a little more positive about things.
Right. So what I understand from your view, Mr. Sardar, is that Charter of Economy is the term that is alternative to the continuity of policies. Am I correct on that front? That is often had been discussed by Planning Minister Hassan Iqbal as well.
Yes. Continuity of policies is extremely important. We take the example of, let's look at Italy. Any investor who invests in Italy knows for the next 7 years, they know pretty much what's going to happen. So when our policies keep changing, even in the same regime, So that sort of creates problems for ourselves. So what we can do is we can have a slightly longer term view, and we can basically bring in all the stakeholders so that their discussion is taken care of at the inception instead of at an advanced stage.
Right. Dr. Murtaza, when we talk about chartered economy, do you also understand that it means the continuity of policies? And what if a certain stakeholder is not willing to come onto the negotiating table in order to discuss and form a consensus regarding the economy of the country?
Well, you know, there are 3 or 4 very contentious economic issues where it would be great to have, you know, some sort of consensus across the board from the left to the right. And, you know, for example, you know, what to do with the state enterprises. You know, they are bleeding us financially, and, you know, their low productivity is affecting the whole economy, but nobody is able to do it. If PMLN thinks of doing something about it, then, you know, the parties in opposition start, you know, making a fuss. If it's PTI trying to do something, then the PMLN would, you know, start creating a fuss about it. So if, you know, there could be an across-the-board agreement that, you know, we need to do something about state enterprises. Then another major area is, you know, fuel prices. You know, we have to have an agreement that, you know, we have to have our prices reflect the global prices. But that doesn't happen, you know, as we've seen in the last 1 year when, you know, the PTI tried to raise them. Then obviously the opposition raised the hue and cry that, you know, you're killing the poor and so on. Obviously give subsidies to the poor, but, you know, in terms of, you know, the majority of the population, the prices that they have to pay should be, you know, reflected in terms of, you know, what the global prices are. Similarly, you know, there's a lot of sectors that don't get taxed because, you know, there are fat cats which have links with all the parties. So, for example, real estate or agriculture. So, you know, there are these 3 or 4 issues on which it is critical to have, you know, some sort of agreement. And then the fact that, you know, we have to protect our economy from, you know, whatever kind of, you know, dharnas you have. It shouldn't be done in a manner where, you know, you really bleed the economy. So definitely if somehow, you know, the politicians could sit and have some sort of agreement on these 4 or 5 issues, that would be great. But then, you know, the issue is how do you get them to talk and come to this sort of agreement? And in that case, you know, I would say the 2 older parties, PPP and PMLN, have shown more maturity in terms of, you know, sitting together and, you know, trying to sort out some of these issues. You know, so the Charter of Economy idea comes from the Charter of Democracy idea, which was done between PPP and PMLN, who were also sworn enemies in the 1990s. But right. Now you have...
Your point is well taken. Dr. Niaz Murtaza, political economist, joining us on the phone line. We really appreciate your time. We were also joined in the studio by Mr. Faheem Sardar, Senior Policy Specialist, Strategic Policy Planning Cell. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Sardar, also. And on Skype, we were joined by Ms. Ariba Shahid, business journalist. Thank you very much for your time also, Ms. Ariba. We really appreciate that. And that's all from today's Views on News. Until the next one, take good care of yourselves.